Hey everybody. So I wanted to do another Gamestop video, clear up some, frequent misconceptions that I'm seeing in the comments and offer my outlook to what I think is coming next. I'm very bullish here, obviously, but I did want to just clarify something, so let's jump right into it. I'm going to start with just some rudimentary knowledge into the triggers. So I noticed people were expecting things to happen instantly with this weekly, monthly trigger in the forms of a melt up. And while I do fully believe that melt up is coming, I just wanted to kind of explain on a little deeper level how these things work. So to start, I wanted to go over just a little bit of trigger knowledge, and we'll go from there. So the triggers are 6 triggers: 1 minute trigger, 5 minute trigger, hourly trigger, daily trigger, weekly trigger, and monthly trigger. So all the trigger crosses work exactly the same. We'll start on the smallest time frame, the 1 minute trigger crossing the 5 minute trigger. So you have that bullish crossover here um, at some point on Friday, and you could see the bullish crossover here, followed by a little bit of a retest. And this is always where we love to take long positions, because after bullish crossover, that retest is usually bought right back up, because once the 1 minute trigger crosses above the 5 minute trigger, the algos know that they can buy dips at the 5 minute trigger. And so usually after the retest, the dip is bought, followed by a strong upside move. So we like to put our buys right here at the triggers with a stop loss back below. The 1 minute trigger would cross back below the 5 minute trigger, and from there, ride it until there's signs to exit. So that's the 1 minute trigger crossing the 5 minute trigger. If I take now away the 1 minute trigger, move up a bit, let's talk about the 5 minute trigger and the hourly trigger. So earlier in the day, Friday actually, we could see the 5 minute trigger crossing above the hourly trigger. And again, just like the 1 minute crossing the 5 minute trigger, that tells the algo that it can now long dips at the hourly trigger. So you could see pullbacks after the 5 minute trigger crosses the hourly trigger to the hourly trigger are bought here and then here again. And over time, you can see price moving well to the upside. So that's 2 trigger crosses done. Again, very simple, works exactly the same. 5 minute trigger crosses the hourly trigger. We like to buy the dips after price retests. Invalid if the 5 minute trigger would cross back down below. But otherwise, these dips are usually good buys. And then price moves up. Now we'll zoom out a little bit more. Here's the hourly trigger crossing above the daily trigger. And here there actually wasn't a retest, but after price broke above the daily trigger, with strength, with velocity, with volume, price started to explode higher. And then the algo knows that it can buy dips at the daily trigger. So you can see when this eventual pullback happened to the daily trigger, it was bought, and then you had a beautiful upside move shortly after. So we spoke about the 1 minute trigger crossing the 5 minute trigger right here, and the 5 minute trigger crossing the hourly trigger, and the hourly trigger crossing the daily trigger. You can see it all works pretty much the same. Now, we'll go one more step. The daily trigger crossing the weekly trigger. This is on Tesla a couple years ago. And you can see after the daily trigger crosses the weekly trigger, you get these pullbacks, and it's bought at the weekly trigger because the algo knows now that the daily trigger is above the weekly trigger, it can buy dips here. So it buys the dips here at the weekly trigger. Dip again is bought at the weekly trigger. Dip again is bought at the weekly trigger. Dip again is bought at the weekly trigger. And then you have this slow upside crawl. And then you could see that the dips, instead of getting bought at the weekly trigger, the algo moves up, it starts to buy all the dips at the daily trigger here again. And once you see that, that's a sign of strength, and then price continues to crawl and crawl and crawl until it eventually melts up much higher. So again, bullish trigger crosses are fantastic because they tell you that the move is very likely coming, but it does not tell you that it's going to happen imminent or immediate, which I've never spoken about in any of the 9 videos that I've spoken about the upcoming GME Meltup so far. Never once did I use that phrase or terminology, and never once did I condone the use of weeklies, which a lot of bitter people keep coming in my comments. Sounds like they are messing around with weeklies on a setup that we're expecting to last for months and months and months, if not a year or 2 years. So what we expect in GameStop is once the weekly trigger crosses the monthly trigger, a slow, relentless climb with all dips being bought, followed by eventually, at some point, the bears can't take it anymore. And that's when, and the FOMO joins in, and the massive volume influx, and that's when you see the crazy melt-up happen. But until then, we're just going to expect slow and unrelenting upside with all dips being bought once we do finalize this weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover. Now, I wanted to zoom out a bit and put the melt-up talk on the side and just discuss why the weekly trigger crossing above the monthly trigger is just such a great sight to see for GME shareholders regardless. Now we could see this bearish weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover, which put the stock in a little bit of a downward spell. Price went from about 27 all the way down to 10, so obviously some nasty work by the bears. And during this whole time, I was pretty worried as a shareholder, and I definitely wasn't having a good time because I know that once the weekly trigger crosses below the monthly trigger, especially on meme stocks, it could spell to be a pretty big disaster. Some examples of that we saw are with AMC. AMC had a really great upside move here when price broke through the monthly trigger, then accelerated higher. But here you can see the weekly trigger crossing below the monthly trigger. And just like we showed before, where all dips get bought after the trigger cross and price continues moving up, if I invert the scale, you can see that's kind of exactly what happened. The weekly trigger crosses bullishly above the monthly trigger, and then this pullback is bought, and then price just keeps going and keeps going. But in reality, the opposite happened. It was a bearish weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover. Bears took full control of the stock. Even this huge pop was shorted because the weekly trigger is now below the monthly trigger. And, well, we all know what happened next. Unfortunately, we had a very similar situation with Bed Bath & Beyond. The stock was moving well while the weekly trigger was above the monthly trigger. Here you can see that bullish weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover, a little bit of a pullback, and then a nice fat melt up for BBBY after the weekly trigger, monthly trigger bullish crossover. So kind of like we're expecting to happen soon with Gamestop. But you could see that once there was a bearish weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover, all pops were shorted right back down, another pop shorted right back down until the stock eventually got delisted. And that was all from this weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover. So even though GME was always fundamentally in a much better position, especially now with the 4 billion or whatever it is now that they raised from those offerings, once the weekly trigger crossed the monthly trigger, it wasn't easy being a shareholder and being bullish because we were able to see what happened with other meme stocks that had this bearish crossover. It didn't turn out too well for them. But the fact that the weekly trigger is about to cross the monthly trigger here tells us that bears gave it all they can. They truly did. They tried their hardest, and they gave it to us. They really gave it to us with 7 or 8 months of just pretty nasty downside. The stock declining 60-70% in value. Once the weekly trigger crosses the monthly trigger, it's night-night for bears, essentially. Now it means that bulls have fully taken control over the stock, and there's nothing left for bears to do besides short pops and short pops and short pops, but all dips will get bought until eventually shorts are blown out of the water, and that's when you see that Meltup occur, which I've stressed a couple of times that I think will come when risk assets start to fly, Bitcoin breaking to all-time high, as that's kind of how it played out in January 2021. I showed it in the last video, but I'll just show it again. You can see that just like the last halving cycle with Bitcoin, when Bitcoin broke out of this inverse head and shoulders, whatever you want to call it, once it finally started its breakout, you could see pretty shortly after is when the GameStop January 2021 move happened. So I'm kind of expecting something similar here. Bitcoin has been raging for a while. There's a very obvious resistance here. I think once that resistance breaks and Bitcoin starts to pump to all-time high, that's when we're going to see the melt-up happen in GME. But until then, I'm still expecting some really strong upward price action once we finalize that weekly trigger, monthly trigger crossover. And we actually did have it for a day last week, but what happened was the weekly trigger moved up with the new week, and then the monthly trigger moved up once we moved from September to October. So kind of like negated the cross a bit. Still think overall it's going to happen. If it wasn't going to happen, I think it would have got invalidated here. To me, just very simple, the fact that it got saved here when things look the bleakest tell me that most likely this setup is going to happen no matter what. And so I'm kind of went into Zen mode here. I think this is only a matter of time until this crossover occurs and GME starts the move that we've all been waiting for. As to what's going on right now, I do find the setup strikingly similar to what Bitcoin has just been doing. So I'll show you guys here. You can see price broke down below the daily trigger here and then had a bearish hourly trigger crossover. And like we explained before with all the crossovers, except this one's bearish, after there's a bearish crossover, retests are shorted. Retests are sent back down. So we can see a bearish crossover followed by a retest and then sent back down. Then tries for the hourly trigger again, sent back down. But then the weekly trigger, buyers are just showing up too much. The weekly trigger is much stronger than the hourly and the daily trigger, meaning the weekly trigger is a much stronger support than the hourly and daily triggers are resistance. Price breaks above the hourly trigger, breaks above the daily trigger, gets a bullish crossover, followed by a little retest, and now it looks like it's off to the races pretty much. So I find it, pretty similar to GME here. I'll remove the monthly trigger just to show you guys that it is similar. So same story. We had the bearish hourly trigger, daily trigger crossover. price retested. Obviously, it got sent back down because once the hourly trigger is below the daily trigger, this area is going to act as resistance, just like we saw here on Bitcoin. Everything works the same. GME is no exception. And then gets sent back down, tries for the hourly trigger again, gets rejected, just like here, gets sent back down, tries for the hourly trigger, gets rejected. What I want to see from GME this week is, more than likely one more dip to the weekly trigger for bulls to come in and really send it right back up. And then just like Bitcoin, I think we could see something of this sort where the hourly trigger will continue coming down. Price will hold the weekly and monthly trigger, break through the hourly trigger, break above the daily trigger, get the bullish crossover, retest the daily trigger, and then explode higher. Pretty much just like Bitcoin's doing right now. So the way it would look, I guess, just that's not going to be easy to scale. But we'll try it. Yeah, that's going to be much harder than I thought it would be, so never mind. But you guys get the picture. What we want to see is just the weekly trigger to continue holding support. We had 3 tests here, 2 tests here, so probably one more test. Break through the hourly trigger, break through the daily trigger, and then I think it'll really start to get going. And of course, watch that 24 level. Once above 24, it should be an easy shot to 30. So again, for me, overall, nothing has changed. I gotta admit, this was a little bit frustrating because usually when we have hourly trigger, daily trigger crossovers, you get like a little bit of a retest and then price is off and running. Here, it got just knocked right back down. So that was a little annoying. There was also extremely low volume. So even though the daily trigger was able to hold, 1, 2, 3 times, eventually with such low volume, the triggers work best with higher volume. They work much less well with low volume. So price just broke right below it. And once it did, and turned it into resistance here, it was an obvious trip down to the weekly and monthly triggers, which held, which is very satisfying to see. And now I think once we could come out back above the hourly and daily trigger, that's when things can really get rocking. And keep a close eye on Ethereum Classic because I don't think we'll see anything crazy until Ethereum Classic starts to make a move. If you've been following this, I think Trading with Emotions was the first one to really pick up on this, but in general, Ethereum Classic kind of, kind of pumps a little bit before Gamestop. So usually you could get a pretty good hint once this starts its move that GameStop will probably start to move pretty shortly after. So you can see kind of like how all the pumps Ethereum Classic just went a little bit before. So here was the big one, and then GameStop ran. And we had another one here, and then GameStop ran, and then this happened, and GameStop ran, and then this happened, and GameStop ran. And then even here, before the massive push that we saw back in May, Ethereum Classic did make a huge move first. There was a little bit of a delay, but then GameStop went. So Ethereum Classic has kind of been basing a bit. Once I see this, really break out, that will tell me, okay, maybe it's time to get more aggressive with options positions maybe or more shares. But for you guys like buying weeklies every week for a setup that I expect to last many, many, many months, if not over a year, and then coming back to my comments to like taunt me when things aren't going up every single day on a macro setup, I really don't have anything to say to you guys. Like, that's on you, man. Like, I'm playing this. I have a pretty solid plan in place that doesn't involve recklessly betting on shorter dated contracts. I haven't mentioned anything about that in any of my videos. Haven't condoned it once. I do take them when the setup looks great. And once I hit them, I take my profit and roll it into longer dated stuff. But I'm not recklessly YOLOing weeklies every single week. And I don't know why you guys think you could do that and then come back and blame me for it. So I would appreciate it if that stopped. But otherwise, weekly trigger is pretty close to crossing the monthly trigger. I think it's going to happen just because, again, if it would have broken down, it would have happened here. Obviously, some bulls understand what's going on and save it when it needs to be saved. So right now, I'm really excited to be a GameStop shareholder. I'm really excited as an options trader as well because I think the opportunity that's about to hit, we haven't seen anything like it since AMC went from 9 to 72 in June of 2021. So overall, I'm really excited, really zen. I think it's only a matter of time here. And I'm just watching Bitcoin to get a closer proximity of when I should start getting much more aggressive with my positions. Until then, good luck, everybody.